December 18, 1944. In a frostbitten slit trench outside Bastogne, Corporal Eddie Voss pressed the cold metal of his headphones tighter against ears that no longer felt like they belonged to him. Through the hiss and spit of winter static, a phrase cut through and froze him harder than the air could. A German Panzer officer coolly relaying coordinates, not for his own armor, but for American positions. Eddie's thumb hovered above the transmit key. Orders were ironclad: never talk on enemy nets. Doing so could earn a court-martial. But 2 miles to the west, 300 exhausted Americans slept in their foxholes, and heavy treads were angling straight toward them. Eddie shut his eyes, drew in a breath that burned his lungs, and let flawless German flow into the ether. For those drawn to untold stories of silent defiance and battlefield courage, subscribe to WW2 Hidden Truths to uncover more moments history almost forgot. This is the tale of how a single radio man defied every regulation to spare a battalion, and why the Army later tried to smother the aftermath. If stories like forbidden wartime ingenuity and buried courage grip you, tap subscribe now. You won't hear this kind of account anywhere else. Eddie wasn't supposed to be tuned in. The Signal Corps lived on doctrine. Operators had assigned friendly frequencies. They pushed traffic up the chain. They checked tubes, cleaned contacts, kept sets humming. What they did not do was twist dials across enemy bands unless an intelligence officer signed the authorization. That prohibition had sensible roots. Scanning German chatter diverted focus from immediate duties. Raw linguists could be manipulated by deliberate lies. And worst of all, an ill-timed reply could expose units, betray patterns, and wreck operational security. But Eddie had never been a man who obeyed rules he couldn't reason with. Limits made sense when they preserved lives. He bristled when they preserved bureaucracy. The gap between those two things, on a freezing night with armor on the move, felt like a chasm he could not afford to respect. He came from Milwaukee, the child of Germans who had crossed the Atlantic in 1923, chasing steadier horizons. At home they conversed in German until Pearl Harbor turned a mother tongue into a liability. He absorbed the language from his grandmother's voice, not just polished grammar but the oddities and flavors, Swabian turns of phrase, the clipped bite of Prussian instruction, the softer roll of Bavarian vowels. By the time he signed on in 1943, he could slip between accents like a stage actor, gliding from Hamburg's brisk consonants to Munich's warmer cadence. The Army stamped him fluent at basic and put him on the signals intelligence track. Yet somewhere in the human paper mill, a misfiled form or rushed assignment sent him not to a London desk, but to the 101st Airborne as a field radio man. He soldered, he relayed, he froze, he stayed wet, he waited, until the Ardennes cracked open. When Hitler hurled his winter gamble on December 16th, the American line didn't bend. It snapped. Units were isolated. Roads jammed, wire lines went silent, regiments bled and stumbled into pockets. In that unraveling, Eddie found himself in a shallow scrape with an SCR 300 that still worked, a German set salvaged from a shattered half-track, and a pair of enemy headphones that, somehow, delivered sound with painful clarity. There was nothing to do but listen, so he did. He let the dial roam and caught stray slices of speech. Armor platoons confirming fuel stops, infantry pleading for ammunition, observers nudging shells left and right. At first, none of it could be acted upon. None of it belonged to him to act upon. It was simply the knight talking in his grandmother's language while aiming metal at men he knew by name. Language helped, but Eddie's sharper tool was pattern recognition. Before uniforms and mud, he'd been the guy Milwaukee Electric sent when customers said their houses felt wrong. He trusted the hum of transformers, the pulse of mains, the temperament of a breaker on the edge of failing. Machines telegraphed moods if you listened with patience. Huddled under Belgian snow, he fell into that old way of hearing. The ether became a system. He mapped its cycles. A tank commander prefaced grid lines with a habitual moment mal. An artillery spotter put a faint hiss in foyer, a lisp betraying a childhood speech habit. A logistics man ended with a bored enda, as if stamping a form and pushing it aside. Eddie's pencil scratched in the dark while breath turned to crystals above his lip. He began drawing ugly little maps, annotating nicknames and clumsy unit marks in the margins. He noted frequencies, call signs, handoffs, duty rotations. He traced signal strength changes like faint shadows on a wall. Within 3 days, he could identify voices without introduction. He knew which Panzer battalion lurked northeast of town, and how low their jerry cans were running. He understood that whoever commanded them was cautious in a way that suggested experience rather than fear, and that this officer distrusted shortcuts across fields that hadn't been checked for mines. Night after night, the mosaic sharpened until it might as well have been printed on onion skin and laid over a map board. On the fourth night, the careful commander's rasp drifted in again and then transformed Eddie's posture from slumped to coiled. New orders, a redirection. The language remained tidy, procedural, stripped of drama, but the implications struck like a thrown grenade. The armored column would pivot toward a fuel depot 2 miles west. That depot, at that hour, was ringed by American infantry catching what sleep they could in a world that sounded safe only because it was muffled by snowfall. 40 enemy tanks and their escorts would convert those quiet holes into tombs before the men inside had time to lace boots. Eddie's hand rose toward his own transmitter and froze. Monitor friendly nets. Route reports up. Under no circumstances respond on enemy frequencies. The words had been drilled until they lived in muscle memory, but muscle memory wouldn't outrun tracks and steel. He glanced at the captured German set leaning in the shadows like a forbidden tool. It had sat there for 2 days, stripped from the ruined half-track's radio bay, quietly daring him to put it to work. He had intended to tag it for intelligence to earn a nod and a handshake later. But intelligence was miles away. The Panzers were minutes away. In his gut, a calculation settled with a solid click. If rules were a dam, the flood now on the other side was human life. He spun dials on the enemy set and warmed the filaments, sometimes to keep your own alive. The only path was to step into the adversary's skin and wear it better than they did. By then, the Panzer officer felt like a neighbor whose footsteps you recognized through thin apartment walls. Eddie understood how the man paused as if pinning a finger to a map before reading coordinates. He knew the cut of jaw when it agreed in form but not in spirit. He heard that weary half-exhale whenever headquarters demanded speed that terrain, fuel, and common sense couldn't support. The call sign on paper read Eisenfaust 4, Iron Fist 4. In Eddie's mind, it grew a face and a name, Klaus. He had no basis beyond intuition, but it suited the timbre, capable, drained, loyal to men and duty rather than to slogans. Naming the voice didn't romanticize it. It focused Eddie's moral lens. He was not gaming an abstraction. He was preparing to outthink a professional. Under normal doctrine, German radio work married precision and strict hierarchy. In peacetime or in well-fed campaigns, it was nearly elegant. But the bulge was stress personified. Lines of supply had been stretched like worn elastic. Operators dozed between sentences. Batteries died in the cold. Authentication sequences, those little proofs that turned voices into authority, were shortened or skipped altogether to keep units moving. Recognition replaced cryptographic ritual. Familiar phrasing, known cadence, and the comfort of a superior's tone outweighed the checklist. That expedient cleared pathways and inadvertently cut a hole in the floor. If a listener captured the music and the measure, he could write the next bar and the band would play. Eddie's notebook bulged with details too minor for any single page to deserve but powerful in aggregate. Klaus usually took orders between 200 and 300. His operator's push-to-talk made a distinct click, the kind that comes from a contact that's been worn thin and catches before seating. The officer who issued Klaus's directives always began with a consistent formula. Eisenfaust 4 here, Panzergruppe Kommando, sounding like someone clearing his desk before speaking. And then there was the flesh beneath the armor. Klaus was confident when he discussed lines to hold, more tentative when told to thrust into terrain he couldn't read, openly anxious about mines. Each time he was told to pass through ground that hadn't been vetted, he stopped the exchange to demand, not once but twice, whether the way was truly clear. That obsession with mines wasn't paranoia. It was memory. Somewhere in the last week, 2 tanks under his charge had jumped in an instant. Crews he probably knew by laugh and by cigarette brand suddenly gone. If Eddie had ever wanted a mercy for the man, it would have been to spare him another one of those vignettes. But war did not offer mercy to both sides at the same time. Eddie also noticed a quieter rhythm. When orders sounded like home, known voice, reasonable plan, properly structured, Klaus replied without space between sentences. When the call sign changed or the demand offended his sense of tactics, he created a sliver of delay, a subtle stall, then asked for confirmation. He was not a robot. He was a thinker inside a set of rules. His skepticism had a shape. If you matched the shape, it turned off. Many people believe suspicious minds are omnidirectional, alert to everything. In reality, they scan for subtractions and distortions. Present the right silhouette, hit the right steps, and the guard dog goes back to its mat. That insight, born from electrical rooms and quiet attentiveness, sat heavy in Eddie's chest as he rehearsed phrases. He could replicate the diction. He could time the pauses. He could word an order that did not scream trickery because it wasn't a wildly implausible detour, but a reasonable alteration. Slower route, alleged mines, an alternate approach that kept the column alive while pulling it away from 300 sleeping Americans. He would be operating without sanction, outside his pay grade with artillery triangulation, a near certainty if he stayed on air long enough. He would also be taking a man who had been humanized by hours of listening and turning his fear into a lever. The arithmetic of conscience is pitiless in war. Eddie could save the battalion to the west and, in doing so, likely send Germans into terrain that hurt them instead. He felt that awareness as a real weight, not an abstract, but he was an American soldier, and his oath told him which lives he was expected to accept as his own responsibility. Ethics mattered. Outcomes mattered more when lives were measured in minutes. The snow intensified, a gray veil that dulled muzzle flashes miles away and turned the forest edges into brushstrokes. Eddie found the voice again and prepared to inhabit it. He never got to transmit. Before midnight, a shadow blocked the white. Captain Morrison stood above the trench with 2 military policemen, and the essence of winter written across his expression. "Headset, Corporal." The sentence cut like wire. Eddie slid the phones off and the German syllables faded to a whisper. "Sir, there's a situation. You've been surfing enemy bands for 4 days without authority." Morrison kept his temper tight, tamped down the way officers do when they plan to do everything by the book. "You have pages of notes, no clearance covers. You kept enemy equipment and never logged it." One MP crouched into the hole and began unplugging the SCR-300 with tenderness that felt like an insult. Then the German cans. Then the little notebook that had become half of Eddie's brain. Watching it vanish into a canvas bag felt like watching your own hands being tied in front of you. "Sir, you're missing the picture," Eddie managed, stepping toward urgency without disrespect. "A Panzer column has been retasked. Their commander, call sign Eisenfaust Fear, got instructions to hit a fuel point west 2 miles. Our boys are there right now." Morrison's jaw flexed. "Do you know how many imaginations send us false alarms in a week?" Every soldier with a household dictionary thinks he can outfox an entire German staff. Your job is to move friendly messages and maintain sets. Intelligence evaluates the other noise. "This isn't noise," Eddie said, but it came out thinner than he intended. Morrison gestured to the MP bagging the captured set. "Ever consider you're listening to what they want you to hear? They seed us with allurements precisely so amateurs will parrot them upstream." The break wasn't anger. It was an internal link snapping under cold pressure. Eddie grasped for one last lever. "Then verify. Dispatch a runner. Wake the depot. Tell them to prepare." Nothing fancy, just assumption of contact. Morrison studied him as if measuring whether the plea itself was a breach. When he spoke, the ice softened by half a degree. "Voss, you've been a rock on that radio. Nobody's disputing that. But you crossed into a lane that isn't yours. You will cut all enemy monitoring now. Speak of this to no one. Touch captured gear again and I'll sign the charge sheet myself. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." It rasped like a match on damp paper. "Get some rest. You look like you've been buried alive." Then they were gone, boots squeaking on powder. Equipment bags bumping legs, authority evaporating into the dark. And Eddie sat in the husk of his post, listening to the loudness of snow. The German set had been his bridge. The notebook, his map. The headphones, his ears, all gone. Out beyond the tree line, steel warmed in idling engines and gears would soon bite. He forced his breathing to settle and tried to conjure a chain of events that could still protect the men to the west. Perhaps Morrison would relent, would pass the rumor along, would find someone who would flick on a lamp and pick up a field phone. Experience told him reports like that buried themselves in piles. Their sources weighted and scored. Unauthorized corporals ranking far below code books and colonels. Snow covered the world's edges until every shape looked honest, and no shape was. Eddie hugged his coat tighter and chased possibilities. There had to be a lawful path. A lieutenant who knew him personally. A sergeant who could break rules more safely. A way to lash his warning to something with credentials. Voices drifted through the white from a supply trench. A conversation half stolen by wind. Pulled everyone we could spare to the perimeter. Tapo's nearly dry anyway. The other voice answered, practical as a ledger. If they punch through, better to have bodies than barrels, assuming they even know where the dump sits. That stray statement altered the equation. If the depot held little fuel, the immediate objective might be manpower, not gasoline. The Germans would still kill men to retake ground regardless of strategic value. But the urgency shifted shape. Eddie's mind set the thought aside and kept moving. He rehearsed telling the story to himself until each sentence felt believable enough to carry to a skeptical ear. There was an intelligence captain back near Regimental who had once borrowed Eddie's spare tubes and returned them with thanks. Maybe gratitude still counted. If Eddie could reach him fast, the man might dispatch a wire or send a patrol. The window was closing. Snow could hide footfalls, but it also made distance a punishment. He took stock of what remained. He had his own SCR-300 stripped, but not yet carried off. He had no enemy headset, but he still remembered the frequencies with cruel clarity. He had a long habit of making broken things work enough to matter. He could solder in the dark with numb fingers, or failing that, whisper to any runner he could find and deputize courage. The danger was real and immediate. Radios invited artillery, and snow carried sound in strange ways. Yet waiting for permission had guaranteed nothing but funerals. If his job was to keep communications alive under impossible conditions, then perhaps impossible included speaking truth into ears that didn't want it yet. He thought of Klaus again, not to pity him, but to sharpen the plan. If the column slowed, if it diverted, if it believed a route was mined and chose a different approach, the timetable reshaped, and their axis might miss the sleeping Americans entirely. Eddie had learned how to sound like a man who knew what he was talking about. He had learned, long before guns, how to carry himself in rooms where he technically had no standing. He could do it again for 60 seconds, 30 even, and then be gone. Eddie imagined the exact words he would use, the tension between authority and warning, the engineering of a phrase that would pass through Klaus's filters and land as obvious truth. He also revisited the risk palette soberly. If the Germans triangulated him, the foxhole would become a target reference point and winter would transform into shrapnel. If his own chain of command caught him a second time, the charges would be accelerated, and in wartime, punishment could be spectacular. He weighed that against rows of men whose faces he had seen at mess and across fire lines. The human mind can hold competing truths for only so long before one becomes heavier. In Eddie, it did. He would move. He would do it cleanly, quickly, and with the professionalism of the very officer he planned to impersonate. The decision in a man's chest often finalizes before his thoughts catch up. Eddie felt that click and began to act, but footsteps returned, soft as fur on snow. Different voices, different posture. Not MPs. 2 medics, a runner, a hard-breathing private from H Company, all speaking at once about a patrol that had seen shapes where shapes shouldn't be, and tracks that led to places officers had sworn were impassable. Information, like water, finds the cracks the dam builders missed. Eddie listened, asked 3 precise questions, and heard enough to know the battle would not wait for doctrine to tie its laces. He rose, lifted the SCR-300 like an infant rather than a box, and stepped into the wind as if it were a hallway. He kept no illusions about heroics. He did not want a medal. He wanted effect. He looked for the shortest line between what he knew and a decision-maker who could do something in 5 minutes instead of 50. Distance in snow is its own enemy, but at night it can also be a veil for resolve. Eddie moved with it, the way a man moves who is scared and stubborn in exactly equal measure. He rehearsed the sentence that would open the door, polite, clipped, offering detail without drowning the listener. He tasted the German phrases once more, just to make sure the tongue remembered where to put the corners of words. He checked the time. He imagined tracks grinding, men waking, and 100 small choices that might make the difference between catastrophe and a hard night that would be remembered as survivable. Somewhere, the Panzer commander Eddie called Klaus waited for a voice that always began the same way. Somewhere, an American captain weighed the spectrum between trust and procedure. Somewhere, Intelligence officers juggled reports and tried to discern signals from noise while good men shivered and tried to keep feeling in their hands. In that narrow channel where all those currents met, a single radio operator prepared to commit a beautiful, dangerous kind of truth. That sometimes the correct line to draw is the one nobody authorized. He walked into the storm with that line in his pocket, ready to lay it across the map and dare the world to argue. That sector had fallen into a hush for 48 hours, and the chatter that once filled the ether bled away to nothing. Eddie sat rigid as a fence post, letting the last scraps of information settle into place. The fuel dump wasn't merely unguarded. Someone had purposefully emptied it of bodies and hope. Command had gambled the Germans were blind to its exact position. It was a wager with 300 sleeping men as collateral. But Klaus wasn't blind. Eddie had heard the grid squares with his own ears, and in roughly 4 hours that German officer would be handed his final marching orders, sending 40 armored beasts west toward men left bare on purpose. Eddie glanced at the foxhole's shadowed corner where the captured enemy set had once rested like a forbidden talisman. It was gone now, seized, secured, catalogued somewhere, but not smashed. Devices like that were always diverted to the brain trust for dissection and reports. That meant it hadn't left the base. He had never lifted anything that wasn't his. He had never openly countermanded authority. His parents had come to America with bent backs and an iron respect for rules. Do your work, mind yourself, keep your neck out of trouble. Sitting in that ice-chiseled hole, with knowledge that burned colder than sleet, he realized the long, straight line of his life had led to one crooked fork. Obedience would mean watching men die. He held still until the night thickened to tar, until about 30 hours had crawled past, until the watch bill reshuffled, until exhaustion and frost gnawed at sentries who'd been fighting for weeks. Then he rose from the trench like a rumor and vanished into the whitening wind. The supply yard sprawled like a drunk man's chessboard, canvas structures sagging under snow, wooden crates stacked by someone whose optimism had been labeled organization. Eddie slid through pockets of shadow, his breath blooming in pale ghosts that the flakes swallowed without a trace. He'd been quartered on this ground for a quarter of a season and knew every trodden path. He could have walked the sentry routes with a blindfold. He knew which tents hid crates stamped with powder warnings and which held contraband slated for intelligence review. The enemy radio would be in the counterintelligence canvas, a glorified broom closet where seized gear sat in tidy rows, waiting for a set of eyes with the right signatures. 2 stakes and a lantern, that was the guard. Who in their right mind steals a busted transmitter from the middle of a war? He tucked himself behind a crate banded in metal, watched the sentry do a child's dance to keep blood moving. A kid with fuzz on his jaw and a nose pinked by the cold, maybe 19 at most. Every few minutes the boy turned and paced 10 steps away from the flap to get feeling back in his toes. 10 counted strides away from the doorway. 10 counted strides of possibility. When the turn came, Eddie flowed forward. He eased the flap aside and slipped into careful mess. Pistols marked for scrapping, optics wrapped in oilcloth, dented helmets, rolled maps pinched with twine. Everything labeled in a clerk's neat hand. In the far corner sat the prize. His German set nested in a crate stenciled for London. He hoisted it like a baby and ghosted out. 15 seconds gone. Back in the hole that had become his address, Eddie's fingers trembled while he opened the case. It still lived. The Germans built instruments to endure mud, shock, and bad luck. He pulled the antenna out slow, listening for a crack that never came. The needle kissed low but not dead. He had perhaps 2 hours of talk time before the heart quit. He drew a ragged scrap from his pocket and began to scribble. Not a speech, not a canned script. If he sounded like he was reciting lines, Klaus would smell the lie in a heartbeat. He wrote reminders instead. The cadence of staff directives, the clipped, bloodless syntax of armored command, the sterile formality that sounded like steel gates closing. He noted the exact nouns they favored, the way they nested coordinates, the proof of receipt phrases that settled doubts. He rehearsed under his breath, shaping German not as a neighborhood tongue but as an instrument wielded by men raised to be obeyed. Accent was a minefield of its own. Too sharp and he'd fall south into Bavarian song. Too soft and he'd drift toward Austrian sing-song. Klaus answered to men with northern iron in their voices. Prussian spine, Berlin crispness, maybe a Hamburg edge. Consonants cut, vowels set neat, emotions hidden under polished boots. He practiced the texture of authority. Not loud because volume is only a hammer, but sure, every syllable delivered like a verdict. He ran the rhythm again and again, refining each bit of tone in his head until the sound in his memory, voices he'd recorded in the quiet corners of his mind for 4 sleepless days, began to line up with the sound leaving his mouth. He had learned his grandmother's baker shop German, the immigrant's market dialect, the workers' everyday phrases. He had not learned the aristocrat's parade field bark, but he had listened hard. He could hear the microscopic habits of Klaus's seniors, the way they tapped stress on the second beat of certain compounds, how they smoothed a phrase that should have bitten. He let those ghosts speak through him until his own breath carried their weight. The math on the technical side was easier. He needed the right channel, the exact slice of spectrum Klaus would be riding like a rail. That number lived in his confiscated notebook, but he could have etched it into wood from memory. 43.4 megahertz, the Panzer group's command artery. Timing was trickier. Go too early and the real net would cut in with something different, exposing him as an imposter. Go too late and the treads would already be turning toward the fuel dump. He had watched patterns for 4 days and found a crack, a sliver of time when Klaus expected orders, but before the real voice would drop. That seam opened at 0217. The true orders typically came down sometime between 0230 and 0245. That gave him a quarter of an hour to shape the fiction, secure acknowledgement, and vanish from the air before the authentic weather rolled in. 15 minutes to rescue 300 men or set fire to his own future. He checked his wristwatch with thumb-numb hands. 2:03. 14 minutes until he took a step for which no manual existed. What he planned was a whole catalog of sins in uniform, assuming the identity of enemy headquarters, transmitting on enemy frequencies without clearance, running a psyops con from a hole in the ground with no approval, no backup and no guarantee except his conscience. The penalties ranged from shame and iron bars to a wall and a blindfold. But if the deception worked, 300 Americans would taste coffee at sunrise, and 40 tanks would grind toward death, following a phantom voice. He rolled the tuning knob, teeth chattering for reasons that had given up being cold. The speaker hissed awake with German chatter that warred with static. Fragments of weather, logistics, rueful jokes, ancient swearing. Somewhere inside that woven noise, Klaus hovered at his own set, waiting for orders he believed would arrive from a warm office miles away instead of a frozen slit 2 miles across the dark. Eddie pinched his coat closed at the neck and tuned his mind as carefully as the dial. He ran his lines again, then let them fall away until the spirit of the thing, certainty, economy, patience, remained. The persona settled on him like a uniform. A weary professional of noble birth, confident without effort, issuing instructions that would never be tested because they came wrapped in familiarity. When the watch ticked to 0216, he picked up the microphone. The trembling left his hand. Fear burned out and left focus behind like a steel needle. He pressed the key and waited for the tiny red eye to glow. It lit. He opened his mouth and let the mask take over. His German cut the static like a scalpel. Identification, net authority, unit call sign, command origin, and the signal for new tasking, all delivered in that dry register that brooks no debate. He lowered his pitch just a shade, adding the gravel of a man whose voice had spent 20 winters in tanks. The words tasted odd, not because he couldn't speak them, but because he was now forging them into a blade. Silence followed. The long, hungry kind. 1 heartbeat, then 2, then 5, stretched thin, until the stars themselves seemed to listen. Maybe Klaus wasn't on the line. Maybe he had the wrong slice of spectrum. Maybe the machinery in a room he could not see had changed an hour ago. Then Klaus answered, a hoarse, smoker's rasp that Eddie knew as well as his own pulse. Tank Group Command, Iron Fist 4, standing by. Relief almost knocked the microphone from his fingers. He swallowed and forced himself to be slow. Real authority does not rush. Confidence arrives on measured beats. He let 3 seconds fall like small stones and keyed again. He declared the order change. He paused. Air moved in the speaker, Klaus breathing. The sound crawled into Eddie's bones. He had studied this man's pattern so long that the shape of his silence could be read at night. Klaus did not balk. He asked for rationale, clipped and professional. This was the hinge, the perfect balance point between acceptance and alarm. Eddie offered him a reason rooted in doctrine and pain. Reconnaissance had spotted mines laid along the originally assigned approach. In the last half-day, American engineers had thickened defenses. He let the word mines hang. It was the one that always made Klaus falter. The memory of vehicles erupting from beneath after a harmless-looking patch of ground was prodded too late. Eddie was using that blunt memory, bending it with both hands. 7 seconds dragged by. He counted each one. He pictured Klaus hunched over a map, running his finger along a route, weighing risk against the comfort of instruction. Suspicious. People do not suspect everything. They suspect what doesn't fit. This adjustment fit. Last-minute course changes happen when the front is liquid, and the Germans prided themselves on their agility. Klaus asked for the new path. Eddie fed him bearings and references in a steady stream. Swing to course 035. Anchor off a reference point marked Hartmann 7, new target coordinates to follow. He rattled off grid squares he had memorized from his own side's hazard charts, real killing fields hammered into the earth, meticulously plotted by men wearing the same uniform as Eddie. He was sending an enemy into them, but the path would feel to Klaus like a safe detour around imagined American teeth. He could not simply turn a column without a prize. He named one that sounded practical, not grand. A lightly guarded supply train. Seize, hold, await further instruction. The lie worked because it promised no miracle. It asked for competence, not glory. It did not beg for reinforcements or special handling. It was exactly the sort of mid-level task a tired battalion might be handed at night. Klaus accepted, voice steady now. He gave an estimated time on target, 0530, and signed off in the proper formal endings. Eddie let his thumb slip from the key and sat motionless. His body turned liquid with the aftershock. He had done it. The German officer had swallowed the bait and thanked him for the hook. If all else held, in 3 hours the Panzers would nose into American mine belts under the impression they were marching cleverly around danger. The sensation that slid over him was not victory. It was a cold cave opening in his chest. He had signed men's death warrants. Klaus would die in good order. So would crews with talismans in their pockets and photographs tucked near their hearts. They would go to their ends believing they were faithful. They would never know who had put the whisper in their ears. Eddie hid the radio again, pushing it beneath loose earth, spare blankets, a coffee tin, anything that might break a curious glance. If someone uncovered what he had done before dawn, there would be no explaining it. But another clock had started elsewhere. The real net would come alive around 0230. They would call Klaus on schedule. He would not answer. They would try again, assume trouble. Persistence would grow into recognition. Something had gone wrong in the wiring of the night. He checked his watch. 02224. 6 minutes until the proper voices began to paint the air with their confidence. 3 hours until buried steel would erupt. Somewhere between those points, 300 Americans would keep breathing without ever learning why. At 0532 on December 19, 1944, the first bloom of fire tore the dark apart, a punch so violent that men woke 3 miles away with their hearts sprinting. A second blast arrived, then a third, until the chain reaction churned through the quiet like a beast ripping fences. 12 German tanks were killed outright by the shock and shrapnel, and the pre-dawn struck a deep orange as fuel and ammunition fountained and burned. Klaus died in an instant when his command vehicle rolled its belly across a teller mine. The explosion spiked upward through thin armor, turned fuel to flame, and erased him inside a fraction of a second. He died certain he was executing a wise, evasive maneuver to sidestep an ambush that had never been real. 23 other men perished in the first half-minute. More were broken and ending fast as American gun crews, alerted by the thunder, swung tubes and sent steel walking over the trapped column. Morning found the battalion that had called itself Iron Fist reduced to fragments. They had not been outflanked by superior geometry or crushed by overwhelming mass. They were murdered by a voice that sounded safe. 2 miles to the west, 300 Americans rolled from blankets, grabbed weapons, and filled positions as training had taught them to do, braced for an attack that didn't come. When daylight firmed up the edges of the world, patrols crept out and returned wide-eyed. A German armored spearhead lay shattered in a zone mapped with American skulls and crossbones, the exact sort of ground German units had been briefed to avoid. No American units had planned to meet an enemy there. No operations officer had authorized engagement. Reports that followed were riddled with contradictions. Enemy tanks destroyed in friendly minefields on approaches that made no sense. No evidence our people had lured them. The Germans had driven themselves into a grave as though they had been commanded to do it. Some analysts wrote theories about misread maps, bad weather, or garbled radio cutouts that turned an order inside out. Others muttered about a commander's nerves snapping under winter pressure. Nowhere in official paper did the plain answer appear. Eddie listened to the distant detonations echo across the iced countryside, each boom reaching the foxhole as a dull thud. Relief did not loosen his shoulders. Pride did not warm his hands. What came instead had the slow weight of a stone sinking through a well. He had kept his own men alive by turning other men into smoke. The arithmetic smiled. The ethics scowled. 3 hours after sunrise, Captain Morrison appeared above the trench and climbed down without MPs at his sides, carrying the small notebook Eddie had surrendered days ago. The captain's face was carved from something neutral. He settled across from Eddie and let silence speak first. "Intelligence found something odd," he said at last. "A Panzer column died exactly where your notes called danger. They weren't supposed to be there. Their orders were to hit the fuel." Eddie stared at the dirt. "That enemy radio we pulled off you. Someone liberated it from the CI tent around 1:30. Disappeared clean." He let that hang. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you, Corporal?" Eddie met his eyes, steady. "No, sir." Morrison studied him long enough for the cold to chew at a cheekbone. He glanced down at the notebook, then set it on the ground between them like a card in a game. "What you gathered saved lives. A lot of them," he said. His jaw flexed once. "If you did what I think you did it without a single stamp of approval. Wearing the enemy's voice is a serious business. If they had sniffed the ruse, they could have found this hole by dinner. You would be a memory, and anyone near you would have gone with you." "Yes, sir." Morrison kept going. "You made a bet with other people's lives in the pot, your own included. No safety net. No one who could even say yes had a chance to say anything. That's not the kind of risk I like in men under me. That's recklessness dressed like gallantry." Eddie nodded, slow, accepting the blade. "You're right, sir." Morrison stood, brushed dirt that didn't matter from trousers that were already stained by the war. "My paperwork will say, that enemy armor fell prey to Allied psychological warfare. Vague enough to be true in a very big way. I'll push your name up for a commendation for intelligence value. I am also shipping you to a signals outfit in Luxembourg, effective immediately." He stepped toward the rim, paused, and looked back over his shoulder. "I don't want a confession. I just don't want you near captured air again." "Understood. One more thing," the captain added. "Those 300 who woke to explosions instead of steel, they won't learn your name. There won't be stripes, flags, or a band. No footnote even. Are you built to live with that?" Eddie thought of Klaus's tired rasp, of a man he'd never meet except across empty sky. He pictured the last clean certainty in an enemy commander's head, the faithful execution of a lie. "I can live with it, sir." Morrison gave one short nod and climbed into the day. Eddie Voss spent the balance of the campaign in Luxembourg, far from the teeth of the front, where the work was cables, test sets, and training new hands to nurse temperamental radios back from death. He told no one about the night in Belgium when he borrowed a voice and changed a map. After the guns fell quiet, he went home to Milwaukee, married a woman who liked to laugh at little things, raised 3 children who thought their father had the surest hands in the world, and kept the phones humming until the company gave him a watch and a handshake. He died in 1987 at 64, leaving behind a tidy house and photo albums that had very little war in them. Decades later, scholars of that winter campaign would sometimes tug at the loose thread of Iron Fist's demise. Some sketched the possibility of trickery on the air. Others put it down to plain bedlam, a commander mistaken at the worst hour. The plain truth stayed buried where the cold had once bit hard, in a slit in the ground where a young American had spoken perfect German into the night. crafting orders that arrived from nowhere and saved everyone who never knew. If this tale left a mark, stay with us for more hidden histories of the war's unlit corridors. Often the fiercest fights aren't settled by bullets, but by the nerve to break the right rule when people's lives hinge on it. Eddie Voss never fired a round at an enemy in anger. Yet on one ice-bitten December night, he fought the one battle only he could fight, armed with a captured set, 4 days of listening, and the willingness to become the enemy's echo long enough to protect his friends. Wars are not always won by perfect obedience. Sometimes the victory belongs to the few who can see when the letter of an order must yield to its spirit.